December last year, I took a one-time break from my handheld desires to cover a PC classic, and here I am again with a game that means a lot to me. Plus, it was one of the first ever games I saw played on a laptop, so that's kind of portable. 2005 saw the release of The Movies, which is one of the worst titles for searchability online, almost as bad as Freezer for a screen name. This game was handled by the now defunct Lionhead Studios, who made games like Fable, Fable 2, Fable 3, and some good games too, and has the kind of mid-2000s snark you'd expect from them, and all the sheer business sim needless details you'd expect from a studio headed by a guy who made Theme Park. But my first impressions weren't about the depth or the pedigree. As an 11-year-old, all I was focused on was how beautiful this game was. This was my first immediate instance of thinking graphics could not possibly get better than this, because I could see all the individual hairs on someone's face with a particular hairstyle, thanks to this game's demo, Star Maker. This demo was just here to let us create characters for the upcoming main game, though I now know games even then could look better than this. But I wasn't quite a PC gamer then. All I used that for in 2005 was The Sims 2, World of Warcraft, and Morrowind, because it was an old family computer that couldn't dream of running powerhouses like Doom 3 even if I knew they existed. This pre-release star building demo was really fun, and it helps mitigate the fact that the game only has a small handful of character faces. It's included in the main game now as a separate executable, so you don't need to buy a demo disc anymore, which is good for me, since my copy is still in storage in another city. But a physical CD is still needed for the movies, unless you cracked it of course, since this game hasn't been re-released on Steam, GOG, or Epic, which is probably why no one talks about it anymore. And it doesn't really run well on modern operating systems either, so hoarders still aren't in luck unless they install custom workarounds to fix these instability issues. That sure is a lot of information that isn't about the game itself, so let's start at the beginning, and by that I mean the year 1920. We have an empty, flat, rectangular plot of land, and we as an omnipotent god must turn this into a successful movie studio. And since 1920 was not the peak of the medium, we start with very rudimentary cameras and movies with zero sound effects outside of an accompanying piano. It'll be a long road before we get to true cinema. And this road is an addictive process to me, and I never bore of it. Things start slow with little to build, and in no surprise to fans of the genre, we get a lot more to place and manage later. Though in a nice touch, it's primarily handled by the actual flow of time. This game's soft endpoint is all the way in the present of 2005, which is when the credits roll, but I said soft end since you can still play after that, and the game even has some extra fun writing for the next couple of decades. But obviously they couldn't write an infinite amount of content, so fatigue will set in eventually, and that becomes your real endpoint. In this sense, it's the chillest business sim. It doesn't kick you off, but make no mistake, this game, for most of its duration, is obsessed with overwhelming and stressing you. It's just that it goes easy on you when it expects you to stop. This complexity all starts with our stars. We hire directors and actors who each have an overwhelming amount of stats and bars to keep an eye on. One of least concern immediately on, but will snowball later, is their age. At first your stars will be about 18 to 23, but as I said earlier, time does pass, and thanks to unions, you cannot keep a star hired past the age of 70. You'll never max out their stats, and you'll need to replace the old with new blood as the decades pass, especially since the vanity of Hollywood finds the stars less appealing if they're old, but hey, some plastic surgery will fix that. But since learning skills takes time, it'll be a constant balancing act of using your older, more experienced cast, while also future-proofing your studio of younger talent who are decades away from leaving you. Don't put all your eggs in the original stars unless you want to tank mid-game, when you have to start essentially all over again with only young, inexperienced talent. Their talent is usually tied to the overly simplified, thankfully, 5 genres here, and they are comedy, action, sci-fi, horror, and romance. It's that simple, and we don't have any combinations like sci-fi horror or romantic comedy here, because the developers for once had some restraint. But you'll always need a good balance of genres, cause real world events in our history dictate what the audience wants and it will increase profit. The invention of a television will lead to an increase in sci-fi demand, a first person to climb Mount Everest will result in more action, and the royal wedding will lead to audiences wanting more romance. Stuff like this happens all the time and can impact multiple genres at once, and also lead to specific genre disinterest. Thankfully, knowing 20th century history is not a requirement, since everything is helpfully conveyed with both a user interface which makes sense once you understand what it all means, and more importantly, we are graced with news updates on the radio.
Newsflash, one of our fellow countrymen has walked on the moon.
To the hard of hearing, the timeline at the top also highlights these events in text form whenever they're relevant. That being said, the radio is to me the most charming part of this game, and it soothes me when I should be stressed about numbers. We have era-appropriate instrumental music which all sounds fantastic, and between the musical and news interludes, we have radio hosts and their overly exaggerated personalities.
What say you skip school? Walk out of work and head for the park. It's hot, I'm cool, and this is the music which will be the soundtrack to your day off.
Here's the latest traffic report. Gridlock. That ain't cool. Here's a tune to get you moving.
Well, it would appear we have a new movie studio opening in town. Remember, unlike the wireless, you don't need a good voice to be in a movie.
William Macduff will guide you through the 20s and 30s with his pompous anti-movie attitude. He hates this fad and wants to return to real theatre. Wally Crunkleberger is here for the 40s and early 50s with his anti-communist rhetoric, which is played on so thick that I can't help but chuckle even if it's the same joke constantly. The late 50s and 60s have Mad Dog talking about rock music and his libido, and then the 70s have the tragically short tenure of Randy the Iceman Shaw, who is so cool all the ladies love him. I won't insert my own commentary about the only black DJ being the only one to not last a full decade, but you can imagine I did. The only man good enough to make up for that sad fact is here, the king himself, Andy Wright, who was here from 1978 to 1992 and represents the apathetic Generation X. And then the 90s, through to the opening years of the post-game, have Whispering Kristen, who is a spiritual and meditative woman whose mental health deteriorates over the years to the point that she is in rehab during post-game, which means the future is left with the one and only English Huey who can't get over how different America is. These are an almost essential part of the game, and combined with the news flashes and eventual tech talk updates,
if you've ever wanted to watch movies at home and at any time, then the VCR could be right up your street.
they completely sell the feeling of a century of progress. But in addition to that, they bring humor, and they really lighten the mood of such a systems-driven game that has a lot to handle at once. Progress of time is further thrust upon us with some of the only well-implemented advertising I've seen in a game. Chrysler and Motorola have actual products in-game, which can be used as movie props, and in the case of the former, these cars can be placed around as decorations for the studio. It also means that outside our studio, we have some billboards from both companies' history. These are out of the way and you need to be at the right angle to see them, so it's never made too obvious or forced. But if you want to see some really old advertisements for their products, you can, and it's really nice to look back on. Even the endgame modern ones are nostalgic relics now thanks to time being scary. Motorola is such a 2005 choice for advertising, and I love it here. The newest phones here are still little flip phones with small screens and physical number pads, and I adore that this game was made at the exact time it was. A few years later and everything would be entirely different. And the dated present of 2005 shows itself again in this game's fashion system, where most of the modern clothes are all labelled as 90s fashion. This is because fashion changes over time and your stars need constant makeovers every decade or so that they can't be an out-of-time relic of yesteryear. This is something you need to do yourself since stars don't automatically do this. They only autonomously do small actions, most of which are bad for your bottom line, but they don't know how to update their looks, so the hand of God is what will do it for them. And your godly hand is how most aspects of the game are controlled. It's It's an unusual system, but once you get your head around it, it becomes second nature. And it's so simple, almost to a fault. Grab a person and bring them to the building to hire them for that specific building's specific jobs. Drag your movie icon from the casting area to the shooting area, and whenever stars aren't following the exact shooting schedule, grab them and force them there, albeit this is bad for their mental health. I'll explain that in a moment, but I just need to compliment the sound design here. Slowly pulling on something has a stretching rubber sound, and whenever you pick up any of the humans, they scream as you'd expect. It really does make you feel like some kind of deity, even if you're actually just the founder and head of a regular movie studio, though you are also immortal and can't stop time. And in a touch I love, you can't really do anything when time is stopped. Sure, you can survey the environment and check your stats, maybe even think things over, but since so much of the core gameplay is based on dragging and dropping, and this can't be done while time is frozen, it does help balance things. At best, you can use this time to place down new buildings, but even then they won't be constructed until time is unfrozen and the builders actually come by and construct the building. The joy of this mess is that this always feels like a game where you're trying to keep on top of a million little things at once, and some things will spoil it, like your director leaving the set to drink away their stress. Pausing and micromanaging everything on a moment-to-moment basis would ruin the turmoil here. The reason for their drinking is that every star has a stress meter, and as you'd expect, constant working, improving their image, skills, and just overall not letting them relax will cause this to soar. And every star also has two different addiction meters, one for food and one for drinks. It's treated cartoonishly, which helps keep the tone from crashing, but at the end of the day, this will hurt your bottom line as a CEO, and that is all that matters. They are drinking on your time, so prevent that by treating them well, but that's easier said than done. Because of a drag and drop system, you can really only hire a small number of stars at once, and you can't just spam a button to hire more staff like another Tycoon game. You have to wait for someone to queue outside your hiring building, which doesn't really happen often once you've already hit a good number of staff. And unlike some other games in its genre, it's always a competition. That number on the top right of the screen says what rank your studio is, and all the others are competing against you. And not only is it basically taunting you all the time, but every 5 years an award show happens, which massively buffs your output for the next 5 years if you do well, so you need to be constantly putting out as much high quality entertainment as possible, not only to stay competitive but to also make it easier in the short term. And these awards aren't like our real world equivalent. It's things like most prestigious studio lot, number 1 studio based on all the combined metrics that determine that, best employer which looks at things like having food and restrooms for them, as well as the happiness meter for all your stars. And there are other awards here like best direction, highest charting movie, and best newcomer, and these can be at ends with some of the other awards like keeping your staff happy. Usually business sims only concern me with underpaying everyone as much as I can without complaints, like a real business. But here much more is tested and continuously so. Those awards shows are a dagger through the heart when you don't win much. Because of all these mechanics at once, you can't just have your actors taking long breaks between movies. You need to churn out productions. But also remember they each have a set age limit to work, and working on movies also increases their skills and relationships with co-workers. So pushing them hard is just making them become peak stars later in life. You're crushing their spirit, but for their benefit, trust me. Very early on, it's easy to balance this all since movies start off as very short and usually only have one actor, but it keeps escalating to the point that you have incredibly long movies with 3 stars, a bunch of extras, and stuntmen. Oh yeah, stuntmen. The one and only expansion to the movies was Stunts and Effects, and this was primarily focused on those. The main draw from a business sim mechanic is the stunts, which can fail horribly and lead to your actor or stuntman if one is used, requiring some hospitalization. This was added to the game at 1960, at what could be called the mid-game, and it's the perfect wrench in everything starting to balance itself around the 50s. Now everything is so much more hectic. Even small stunts like a banana peel slip can go badly, but they rarely do. It's the higher intensity explosions and car crashes that will ruin everything. It amazes me how the game overloads so much but never feels too overwhelming or intense. It's comfy to me. I think part of it is just the upbeat tone and radio relaxing me, though the announcer loudly telling me every time a stunt has failed does almost ruin that in the second half.
May I have your attention, please? A stunt has gone wrong, injuring your performers.
Stunts failing or even using inappropriate stuntmen for the actors leads to critical backlash, as can over or under publicizing a movie when you eventually get to the point that you need to build up sufficient hype. Everything is scrutinized, so it's best to minimize whatever flaws can be there, because these really do matter to the bottom line. The first major sticking point will be the script quality, which is an objective rating because this is a systems-based game. This will go up or down based on the star genre experience and their relationships with the other co-stars. Any other stunt-related issues can also have an effect on this. There are lots of other factors too, like crew experience and the technology used, like how does the camera quality compare to what was the standard of the era. But those and other issues like that are basically very linear and easy to stay on top of. Crews are immortal beings, so whoever you hire in 1920 will be there a century later and be absolute masters of their craft. And as long as you use your laboratory to research whenever you can, you'll always be an industry leader in terms of technology. It's all automatically implemented once the research is completed. The laboratory does function similar to other tycoon games, except instead of pumping money into it like Theme Park, you hire researchers and just drag and drop them into each specific field. If you're too far ahead of the curve, the lab will stop functioning. This is to prevent snowballing like a Civilization game. Don't expect to have 1990s clothing invented in the 50s. Very early on you'll fail a lot since your talentless newcomers have no talent, and you'll also be judged for using the same sets over and over. But the 1920s is basically the training wheels saga, and quality control isn't important. Once your crew know what they're doing and you have some more variety in sets, the game starts expecting standards, because competition is fierce. The number of rival studios increases over time, and they are as obsessed with abusing stars as you are. It's an escalating challenge and I can't get enough of it, even if it's the same general loop each time I revisit the game. There are so many variables and a lot of unpredictability in the stars and their temperament, because the rest of the game has to be set in stone. Competition has to be gradually added for the sake of balancing, and historical events can't change, even if the writers did have to carefully work around some touchy subjects, like a famous murder in 1994, or a lot of the more recent history of the early 21st century. In fact, this is a very sanitized view of the 20th century, where all your actors, regardless of gender or race, are treated equally, and audiences have no problem with any combination of them getting it on. Plus, the radio news does not delve into the real horrors of this century outside of discussions of major wars America was involved in, due to it probably being a tonal nightmare to actually be historically accurate in this fun silly game. Back to gameplay. The more popular the stars are, the more demanding they get. This isn't just limited to wanting more pay and larger trailers, they want their own entourage, and due to the sometimes very limited number of total staff available, this can limit the amount of other help you have like maintenance, cleaning, or script writing. And the maintenance is essential since buildings fall into disrepair if not checked, and this can lead to disaster if you're not keeping everything covered. Plus, they are the only way you can move or destroy buildings and sets, since your godly hands have limits. If your star's needs are not met, they can quit, which is a hard feeling since not only does that limit your potential going forward, they didn't even get to bust out their best performances when they're middle-aged and about to retire. Those high stats were taken from you. But this is all just half the game, though it is the half I personally enjoy more, but I know I'm alone in that, because even younger me didn't agree. This isn't just a business sim, it is a movie maker with tools that are both robust and too simple. But hey, this was amazing for making machinima in the mid to late 2000s. You never need to do this campaign mode, there's a full sandbox here for your movie making magic. Just make sure you edit an easy INI file if you want to skip that game and get straight to this, because there are plenty of sets that are only intended for players that actually do really well in the campaign. When we make movies, we have lots of sets and each accommodate a huge amount of scenes. Most scenes have the option to toggle character moods, scene duration or location, and the time of day and available weather effects can be mixed and matched too on top of that. Some props can also be adjusted, so you can have the exact Motorola approved phone in this scene, or for more generic stuff you can just freely change that. This includes the multiple dog breeds you can pet or be attacked by. Extra props can be added to the scene for serious decoration, or to be weird, but hey, it's there. And the Stunts and Effects expansion, in addition to letting you use even more sets and scenes exclusive to it, gives you a free-form camera control even if it is extremely limited, but now you can show what they don't want you seeing. Most of the game's outfits are used here too for the movie side of things, since your stars want to wear regular clothes offset, but there is so much more here to sink your teeth into. It's a very easy to use interface once you wrap your head around it. You can search for scenes with specific words, or just go through a list of props that are in use. That way you can find exactly what you need. And to sweeten this deal, there's a post-production facility that lets you chop up the scenes for more control and add in additional voices or subtitles to actually tell a complete story, because the actors in scenes only use an even more repetitive take on Simglish. The game's community back in the day made some of the first videos I ever saw online, and it taught me words I'd never heard before, like thumbnail. It's weird to think about this, but this 2005 game was an incredible tool made slightly too early to capture the market that it could have. And like its Motorola phones, this is very much a product of the last point in our lives before the standardization of online platforms and the rise of mainstream internet and social media. This game encouraged you to upload videos online, but it was a hassle to do so back then. And it's such a shame that this could have been a huge hit, but instead was just a cult classic with a devoted fan base that for the most part shrank as technology improved and the need for machinima diminished. Nowadays this is just an odd way to make movies that is basically only a novelty now since there are so many better tools available. But this game's charm still wins me over. And more importantly, for those of us that love numbers, playing God, and 20th century history, the other half of this game is still here and never gets old, even if it should, since nothing new has been added in 16 years and counting. But a small modding community has been there from the beginning, and it seems they're still here today, doing small additions every few years before slinking back into the shadows. And that was The Movies, one of my all-time favourite games, and one I've never been able to talk to anyone about, because there are only like 4 of us still alive that play this game, but with your help we can maybe increase that number to 5.